Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. NATO has launched its biggest military exercise since the end of Cold War in Norway recently. Well, at the same time, the Xiangshan Forum is taking place in Beijing, addressing some of the issues related to defense and security. The Deputy Secretary General of NATO is in Beijing to attend the Xiangshan Forum. She believes it is a platform for ideas exchange and also opinion sharing. On the sideline of the forum, I interviewed her, Rose Gottemoelle, a former top U.S. diplomat who's currently serving as NATO's Deputy Secretary General. Before we get down to the interview, take a look at this.
The latest NATO drill is a simulation of Norway under attack and how NATO allies would come to its defense. On Thursday, the Atlantic Military Alliance kicked off in the Scandinavian country its biggest military exercise since the end of the Cold War. Troops and equipment from 31 allied countries arrived via land, sea, and air.
In recent years, Europe's security environment has significantly deteriorated. NATO has responded with the biggest adaptation of our collective defense since the end of the Cold War. Trident Juncture demonstrates that adaptation.
Dubbed as Trident Juncture 18, the exercise is seen as a show of power to remind Russia that the North Atlantic Alliance is strong and prepared to act. In recent years, Russia has been flexing its military muscles over Crimea, increased presence in the Arctic, and carried out a big military exercise in the Far East in September. While Russia was invited to monitor the drill, its foreign ministry spokeswoman called the actions near the country's northern border irresponsible and vowed that Moscow would retaliate if necessary. Despite concern over U.S. commitment to NATO, around 20,000 American soldiers are participating in the Norway drill. The United States is the unmatched world leader in military spending, and Mr. Trump is not the first U.S. president asking other NATO members to spend more on their defense.
I believe in NATO. I think NATO is very important, probably the greatest ever done, but the United States was paying for anywhere from 70 to 90% of it, depending on the way you calculate. That's not fair to the United States.
Around half of NATO countries are on track to meet the goal of spending 2% of GDP on defense by 2024. Before the ongoing NATO drill, Moscow was already protesting Washington's announcement to tear up a Cold War-era arms control treaty, with Mr. Trump citing Russia's so-called violations of the accord as a reason for the withdrawal. If the INF treaty does fall apart, Europe has the biggest stake to lose, as the treaty is meant to prohibit Russia from building up missiles that could reach Europe. In September, Russia invited China to its drill in the Far East for the first time. As China balances between collaboration and competition with other countries, the power dynamics between Russia, China, and the United States are always shifting. In June, President Xi Jinping sat down with U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis in Beijing. While the two touched on their differences, one thing the Chinese president emphasized is that China is always committed to peace.
Madam Deputy Secretary General, what a pleasure to see you here in Xiangshan Forum.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Great to see female leaders in the field of security.
Thank you.
China and NATO, some say, have been inching together, moving gradually toward one another. Do you agree with that interpretation? What could be the fields that the two can really work on near future?
We have already seen some examples of NATO and China working well together. For example, during the height of the fight against piracy off the coast of Somalia, NATO and China were working in close proximity in the maritime sphere, and we had some very successful joint efforts in that context. So we already have some good experience to build on. I think the maritime sphere is an important one, but also we face so many common challenges, areas where we have to be thinking hard about the future and where we go from here on cooperation. Challenges such as the challenge of terrorism, for example, challenges related to new technology. They are both They are both technologies that offer promise, but they offer complexity as well. And so the more that we are talking together, and I think that is the key, to have good lines of communication open and to be talking together, because China is really developing its global reach increasingly. NATO, of course, is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so we have a Euro-Atlantic focus, but we are going to increasingly be operating in the same regions of the world, and so it's good we have lines of communication open. We need mutual predictability and good mutual understanding.
It is not easy for that handshake to take place. Many could remember the moment when China and NATO be able to shook hand. Could you help us, what has managed to help the two sides to eventually walk and work together?
I think it is a very good military-to-military conversation so far. We already regularly have staff talks. Sometimes we are participating together in some courses, for example. So we already have good communications. We have experts who are increasingly getting to know each other. And when there is that good human contact, that's when I think cooperation starts to develop in some very mutually beneficial areas. But it's focused really on what is pragmatic, what works for NATO, what works for China.
But trust, not easy to build. It has to be done through a period of time. Having said that, though, the changes of the world, though, is demanding China and NATO to efficiently create trust and be able to do something, as you just earlier described. How can we solve this dilemma in a way?
Well, any time there's a deficit of trust, it's because, I think, of two causes. Sometimes it's because events have gone in a certain direction and actions have been taken that create a deficit of trust. But other times it's just because there haven't been open channels of communication and there have been no opportunities to get to know each other. In some sense, that's a kind of simple way to build trust, to get to know each other. And so that's why this forum is so important, the Beijing Xiangshan Forum. It's so important because it gives people all over the world the chance to just sit down and get to know each other.
3 decades ago, there was a bombing of the Chinese embassy. Chinese believe it was done by the NATO. That was the lowest point, almost, between the two sides for decades. But the two sides has managed to bring it back to a certain extent, as you have just explained earlier. Now, that kinds of quality and capability probably is even in more urgent need. What are those capabilities? What are those qualities? How can we cultivate them on a pragmatic basis, rather than just words and slogans?
Well, I'll give you a good example from today's discussions. Everyone is concerned about the fight against terrorism, the fight against violent extremism.
Yes.
And terrorists are taking some technologies off the shelf, like drone technologies, and they are employing them in operations. And so NATO, for example, is working on research projects to look for ways to counter such off-the-shelf technologies and look for ways to help in the fight against terrorism. I think we're all equally concerned in these areas, and so that's a fine example of ways in which I think we need to be communicating results and talking about how we need to apply some of these technologies for good reasons and not for bad reasons.
It is only with certain degree of trust that technologies can be shared and can be mutually applied and therefore to work together. It seems that we're always coming back to the trust issue.
That's why I always come back to the communication issue. We have to crawl before we can walk.
Yes.
And walk
Love that.
before we can run. Just like babies, going to children, going to grown-ups. And so I think that if we begin with small steps and particularly with dialogue and communication, we can begin to build that trust.
Some have been asking questions about, China and NATO, what are they thinking if they are working together? Do they have a common direction that they have to tackle? Do they have a common challenge? Some say, what about what's going to be the role of the United States in this cooperation between China and NATO? And what would be the role of Russia?
Well, I think you pointed to common challenges, and that's the most important thing for us all to focus in on. And again, I revert to the example I raised of the threat of piracy off the coast of Somalia. There we had a very large international flotilla focused on providing security for commercial shipping and fighting the pirates. And there we had everybody involved. China was involved, India was involved, Russia was involved, the EU was leading the effort, and NATO was involved. But many of NATO's member countries, including the United States, were involved as well. So at times when we have common security challenges, we need to be thinking about ways where we can come together to work on solving those challenges.
It is no secret that within NATO there has been a big debate over the past few years about what will be the role of the U.S., how much will the U.S. contribute, and how much will the other countries contribute to the overall budget and to the overall capabilities. Where is it going, your judgment of the direction?
We do have a debate in NATO going on now about burden sharing, about defense budgets, but I think about NATO as one big family, and any big family has disputes and disagreements from time to time. I'm sure here in China it's the same. Sometimes there are family disputes, and you work to resolve them and you come back together again. It's been the same at NATO over time. We've had disputes from time to time. The 2003 war in Iraq is a very good example of that. But we've been able to resolve the differences and come back together. Actually, we really think that President Trump has played a good role because he has forced the NATO allies to really sit up and take notice of the commitments that they made in our so-called defense investment pledge to spend 2% of gross domestic product on defense. And so we really are quite positive about the role President Trump's been playing. I have to tell you, though, that every president, I remember President Bush, first President Bush, President Clinton, Obama, President Bush II, they all talk about more burden sharing in NATO. So it's been a consistent message, but President Trump has really driven it home.
Certainly he has his very different style, to say the least.
Indeed.
So now we're probably in a dramatic changing period of time that everybody is rethinking which group to join, which group to keep, where is the partnership, and what's the nature of the partnership. Therefore, I wonder about NATO as well, such a comprehensive, huge body. What is your thought and your colleagues' thoughts about this?
First of all, our work is really focused on the transatlantic space. As I mentioned before, we are the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so we have a traditional geographic sphere where we work. Now clearly, then I get asked, well, how come you're in Afghanistan? Well, we have other, in addition to collective defense in the North Atlantic space, in the Euro-Atlantic space, we have a responsibility to fight terrorism. It's also one of the core tasks of NATO. And indeed, after the 9/11 attack on the United States, that is the only time that the Article 5 commitment was called forth by unanimous consent in NATO, that everyone said we need to stand up with the United States to fight this terrorist threat. It's why we are in Afghanistan today. And so, of course, we really work hard to continue to focus where we need to focus on our own defense and security, but we think because there are mutual concerns around the world, terrorism is a great example of that, that we need to also join with other countries in thinking about ways to fight these challenges together.
If you see the cooperation between the United States and NATO, or NATO as a whole, with the US as an important player of it, for example, the war in Iraq has not necessarily been a success. And NATO as an organization has your own identity rather than all the same on the list with the United States. So how is the NATO identifying your core values, particularly regarding a changing US?
Well, I have to a little bit take
Go ahead,
exception
ma'am.
with your hypothesis, and that is that somehow the United States and NATO are diverging in terms of values. We share the same values. We are a defensive alliance. We are based on the rule of law. We really focus on, if we need to take action, that it should be limited, defensive, and in line with our international law obligations. So we are always thinking in that way, and every member of NATO thinks in that way. Otherwise, we would not be the NATO alliance. It's basic to our DNA, so to say. But the other important thing I wanted to say is that we are 29 members, all of whom have an equal vote at the table. Any big decision that is made at NATO has to be made by consensus. Sometimes people say, oh, the United States, you know, they dominate the decisions. Well, in fact, every decision has to be made by consensus. And I think the Iraq War of 2003 is an example of where NATO did not reach consensus. And so therefore, it was a case where the United States and NATO were not exactly on the same page.
Madam Deputy Secretary General, you used to work for Washington, and certainly you made that switch beautifully. Now for NATO, how do you see this transition? One is working for a national interest, the other is working for a very much a group consensus, particularly at the moment when reaching a group consensus is extremely difficult for many organizations. Ma'am.
Well, you know, my husband, who spent his whole life working in the realm of multilateral diplomacy, tells me I'm very lucky that most of my career has been spent on working bilateral diplomacy with the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation. So I have to say I feel the transition to NATO quite acutely, because now I am in a multilateral organization and I have to work those complexities every single day. But we are a great group, actually. It's like our headquarters at NATO. All the missions are there together. In some ways, it's like a big university campus. We are there working together every day, sometimes rubbing up against each other in the corridors, but always, in the end of the day, coming to agreement.
The world is changing fast, and it's not a cliche. We all notice that every day almost in the headline news. Therefore, what are the priorities? That seems to be a question everybody and every country, every organization is thinking.
We have our responsibilities for our collective defense. That is at the heart of our priorities. We also have responsibility for fighting terrorism. But I want to say further that we take very seriously the necessity to project stability, as we call it, to try to work with countries among our partners, for example, in the Mediterranean, in North Africa, in the Middle East, to try to build up state institutions, defense institutions, to try to build the notion of integrity in these countries in the fight against corruption.
Is there a potential China and NATO would work together on those fronts?
I think it will be very, very important to consider what must be the priorities in the work between NATO and China, and particularly because NATO and China are in very different geographic spaces, and so we have very, very different points of view on a number of things and defensive requirements. But in the end of the day, I think we do have some mutual interests, and we need to explore those.
Madam Deputy Secretary General, what a pleasure once again to be able to have you on our program and share with us your thoughts. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All the best.
Thank you. NATO Deputy Secretary General with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. The weekend is upon us, so have a great one.